Welcome to the Not Old Better Show Smithsonian Associates Series. I'm your host, Paul Vogelzang, and this is episode number 196. As part of our Smithsonian Associates Art of Living Inside Science series, our guest today on the Not Old Better Show is Alan Jasanoff. Alan Jasanoff is director of the MIT Center for Neurological Engineering and studies the brain and the way we talk about it, which is often rooted more in mystical concepts than scientific fact, and which can overlook the physical realities of mental function.
I'm going to talk about my book, The Biological Mind, which is about how interactions among brain, body, and environment govern the mind, and how the brain's role in this can't be separated from its context.
That, of course, is our guest today, Alan Jasanoff, who will be at the Smithsonian Associates Program presenting The Biological Mind, the Brain as a Responsive Organ, Tuesday, April 10th, 2018. Please join me in welcoming to the Not Old Better Show via Skype, Alan Jasanoff. Dr. Alan Jasanoff, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us briefly what we'll learn about the brain at your upcoming Smithsonian Associates presentation.
So I'm going to try to offer an alternative to what I see as an increasingly popular view of the brain as kind of an encapsulation of our identities and almost a modern stand-in for the soul. I'll try to combat this view, the view of the brain as kind of an outlier of the body, and I'll talk about how it's biologically similar to the body and integrated both with the body and with the environment. And then last, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think it's important to see the brain in this way as part of an interacting system that makes us who we are, as opposed to just a unipolar controller of us, and how that interactive view, that integrated view, can influence our analysis of human behavior, our attitudes toward mental illness, and possibly our views about the future of the human mind.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. In my research of you, I found that you talk a little bit about this idea called a cerebral mystique, a kind of a folk myth that surrounds the brain. And when we think of the brain, you say, as a supercomputer orchestrating everything we do, we ignore some of these other influences that you just kind of referred to. So maybe dive a little deeper for us into that. Explain what you mean and why we need to understand both internal and external influences on us.
Yeah, so this idea of the cerebral mystique is kind of a term I made up to denote an idealization of the brain that leads us to think of the brain as more powerful and autonomous than it really is. It's a mystique that conveys wonder, but also sort of maps our brains onto supernatural entities like spirits. And it's not truly spiritual in the sense that it doesn't involve believing in things that just flat out don't exist, but it's based on stereotypes that exaggerate the brain's qualities. So, for instance, the metaphor of the brain as a computer presents it as sort of an inorganic, unbiological entity. A lot of people talk about how inscrutable the brain is in terms of its complexity. And there are also stereotypes about the brain's kind of self-contained properties and its independence, its ability to control the body and the environment, but not be influenced by those things. So I'm going to be talking about my book, The Biological Mind, that tries to present an alternative way to think about the brain. And I try in particular to point out ways that how ways of thinking about the brain are often divorced from scientific facts, and how some of those attitudes create kind of a brain-body divide, where we used to have a mind-body divide, a kind of an idea from old philosophy that we've tossed away. The real brain is a lot more body-like than many people appreciate. It's run by chemicals more than electricity, and its great complexity may not actually be the secret behind properties we don't understand. It may be part of it, but not all of it. The brain is also part of a system that includes everything around it. So it's misleading to think of the brain as in control, but not influenced by these other forces.
So let's talk about some of those forces, kind of this joint, this combination almost of bodily and environmental influences on the brain and our psychology. What are some of those?
Well, I talk both about internal forces that come from the body and external forces that come from the environment. And from within our bodies, some of the best known examples are the hormonal systems that get engaged. For instance, when we feel emotions or when we feel stress, one of the best known such systems is something called the HPA axis. It involves a few different structures throughout the body that give those initials. And this system allows our brain to signal changes throughout the body that make us choose between fighting and flighting. Many people have heard of that system. But as it turns out, the same hormones that are engaged by the HPA axis can also feed back to the brain. And sometimes the causal arrows in the system actually get turned around a little bit. So a great example is in pregnancy, when after a baby is born, there are these gross hormonal changes in the mother that actually influence the brain and make the brain do stuff. So there's both feedback between the brain and body and actually causal arrows that go both directions. Another example I talk about is the example of transplants. So, in a sense, the best experiment to test, how much is in your brain and how much is not in your brain would be to take a brain and put it in a different body, and that's not really possible. But there are bits of people's bodies that get moved around. And as it turns out, that often goes with emotional and personality changes that could be due in part to the kind of pathologies that the transplants were correcting, but also may be due to differences in the physiology of the new organ with respect to the previous organ. Some other well-known examples include, for instance, the effect of exercise on brain function. Mm-hmm. So when you move around a lot, you actually feel more lively, your personality is different, and people have shown that you're better able to perform cognitive tasks, for instance, tasks involving creativity. And that is mediated, it's worked by changes in the body and how it couples to the brain. So for instance, things like blood flow or metabolic changes. Changes that your brain feels, but that originate elsewhere in the body. They can couple the body to our brains. And then the final bodily example that I talk about is how the shapes of our bodies can actually influence our minds. So, there are examples that you can think of, athletes, musicians, whose bodies, in some really core way determine their capabilities and how they think. And that's even true for people like me who were, bad at sports at key times in my life. And I'm sure it steered me in interesting ways. Yeah, you also asked about environmental features. Mm-hmm. How does the external world couple into our brains? And the answer is in many ways. It turns out that a lot of the kind of environmental variables around us, features like light or temperature, colors, kind of aspects of the decor, can influence our mood and therefore our emotional decision making. One of the best known examples there is this thing called seasonal affective disorder, mm-hmm. Which is the kind of winter blues, mm-hmm. is another term for it. It's how when you live in an environment that has low light levels, it tends to make you more depressed. It may be somehow distantly related to hibernation reflexes. On a much faster time scale, we're constantly being bombarded and manipulated by information that comes at us from the environment. So I'm talking about sights, sounds, smells, touches, and tastes, the conventional senses. And they're capturing our attention and influencing our actions at every moment. We like to think of ourselves as noticing things, but actually the stimuli that surround us are often noticing us and grabbing us. Social stimuli, like the sight of a face or the sound of a baby's cry, are particularly potent. And a lot of these act on us without ever rising into our consciousness, kind of just emphasizing the extent to which they control us.
As I say, this is fascinating. I think the brain is such an interesting thing. I think our audience is really going to enjoy this subject. And I enjoyed your book, your excellent new book, The Biological Mind, How Brain, Body, and Environment Collaborate to Make Us Who We Are. And there's a distinction there that you write about, that society today views maybe drug addiction, eating disorders, etc., to problems of the brain. And maybe this is stigma reducing. You kind of allude to that. but it means sometimes that we ignore the idea of moral failings, and we're lumping behavior together as simply brain failing, or your words, broken brains. So what does this lead to in society, and is this maybe a new way to understand and explain mental illness?
Yeah, well, I talk a fair amount in the book, especially sort of after I've brought up the biological problems with viewing the brain as different from the body. I talk
Mm-hmm.
a lot about how it's problematic to reduce human problems to problems of the brain, and that's because if we do that, then we'll be looking only at the brain for solutions to our problems. So in reality, there are problems like antisocial behavior, crime, or mental illness that arise from the combined effects of multiple factors that act both inside and outside of us. So we need to be able to look at multiple different levels, including individualized levels, but also social and environmental levels to treat these problems. Mental illness is a great example. It always occurs against a backdrop of bodily and environmental factors that influence the mind. So one study actually showed that something like 20% of mental illnesses may arise primarily from bodily sources that escape detection. In earlier times, actually, bodily sources like diseases were some of the main causes of apparent mental illness. They were mental illnesses. They were just caused by diseases like syphilis or the vitamin deficiency called pellagra. There are also social correlations to mental illness. These aren't always well appreciated, but turns out that being an immigrant or living in a city, these kinds of social variables correlate with mental illness in a way that seems to be independent of genetic background or anything clearly identifiable in the brain. And then at the even greater level, of course, there are cultural factors that determine our concepts of mental health in the first place. So there are mental illnesses that other countries have that we don't have. If you look back 100 years ago, definitions of mental health categories were totally different, even in the US. So one of the reasons why this stuff is really important is because we want to treat our problems. We don't just want to find them. And if we have an overly brain-centric perspective, really an overly narrow perspective of any sort, we're going to tend to neglect angles that could be useful. So a great example there is how there's been kind of a trend towards brain medicines and away from counseling and behavioral therapies that tend to get downweighted. And there's, I think, a false impression that behavioral therapies don't actually act on the brain, that they don't act on the parts that really matter in mental illness. Well, they do. They act both on the brain and on the systems around us. We ought to take them seriously if they're effective. Another interesting thing that others have written about, but that I cite in the book, is that recognizing psychosocial factors, so in other words, these potential causes of mental illness that are not only in our brain biology, that may actually be most effective at reducing stigma. Because a patient who feels that they have a broken brain may feel just as kind of down or just as alienated from society as someone who feels kind of the moral brunt of accusations from a family or from a community that judges them insufficient. And I want to be clear that I'm actually not seeking to restore the idea of moral failings as causes of either mental illness or kind of mental problems, more broadly speaking. It's actually the opposite. I think that by seeing the brain as part of a tapestry of interacting factors that are woven together and that determine human behavior, we're going to be better at appreciating how multiple influences, both inside and outside of each person, determine what we do.
I know you're very busy, Dr. Jasanoff, so let's go to our final question. You offer kind of this funny question in your book, and you really kind of start off the book with this, and you talk about eating brains, and so I'm going to just ask this question of you: why do humans now study brains instead of eat them? I think we're going to be interested in that answer.
Yeah, well, I can't answer for everybody, but I can tell you that for myself. So I'm a neuroscientist and a neuroengineer, and I study the brain full time, and it's the most interesting thing I can do with my time. At least that's what I've decided for now. On the other hand, I think it's fun to eat them too. And so what I'm talking about in the book is the idea that, and this is really just, as you say, kind of a humorous introduction. I talk about the fact that some people may be reluctant to eat brains because they identify with them. And this is something that actually has some support. There have been studies about it that show that of all the different types of kind of offal, the meat that's not derived from muscle, that brains are actually the most avoided, the ones that people least want to eat. And that may come about because, even animal brains look a lot like ours. And to the extent that we idealize the brain, we don't want to put these things in our mouths. So I think if we demystify the brain and see it as part of ourselves, but not the whole, we may be more willing to see a lump of gray matter on our plates as just a piece of meat rather than a piece of someone's soul. And while I don't necessarily think we need to go out of our way to eat brains, I think having a more neutral attitude towards them might be great, even though I do think they're fascinating enough to study full time. So in particular, I think bringing the brain back down to earth, and this is really the chief goal of my book, can help us from getting too wrapped up in what's inside of each of us as individuals. And I hope that can make us more appreciative of our society and environment, and maybe focus more on what's needed to protect those things rather than just keeping our brains.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Jasanoff. Thanks so much for your time today. We're gonna put this particular presentation on the calendar because this I think is going to be a great one. But we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
My thanks to our guest today, Alan Jasanoff, who will be at the Smithsonian Associates Program presenting The Biological Mind, the Brain as a Responsive Organ, Tuesday, April 10th, 2018, at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. My thanks as well to the Smithsonian team for all they do to support our interviews. As usual, we'll post links to everything, and also, as usual, my thanks to you, the listeners, for joining me today. Your time is valuable, and I'm grateful you're spending some of it with me. I'm always interested in feedback, and you can leave that at iTunes, Google Play, or send me email at info@notold-better.com. Stay tuned for our next show, another great one, as we talk about better. The Not Old Better Show. Thanks, everybody. And remember, check out genealogybank.com/NOBS for great genealogy newspaper articles, history, and data, and to support the show. That's genealogybank.com/NOBS. Thank you.